Hey, deserving listeners, it's just me today. Today's episode is a deep dive on codependency. This episode is just for patrons of the podcast, but I have a little introduction here. I have never experienced a more confused term in my field, meaning that people confuse this term in the lay public, on the internet, but also in my own discipline. I will be working with colleagues or students or fellow professors, and I will hear most of the time, this is just anecdotal, people using the word codependency drastically wrong. And I'm always amazed by this. It's one thing for the public to use codependency wrong because, it's the public and the internet is misleading them entirely. But for clinicians and professors to misuse the word codependency is frankly embarrassing. It's like there are books that you can look into and read the definition. You can go in the glossary and look up codependency, and it will not say the way that people are using it. I mean, long story short, people are generally using it as a synonym for dependent personality disorder. We already have a word for dependent personality disorder. It's called dependent personality disorder. And this has trickled down to the lay public, or maybe it's the opposite direction. I'm going to get into it in this episode. I did a mini deep dive on the history of the term, and I think I have a grasp on why we as a discipline and also as the public is just so ignorant about what codependency actually means. Also, in doing this deep dive, I found that codependency is much more interesting than I thought. As I use the term codependency occasionally, but not often. But when I do, I had an understanding of the concept, but it's much deeper than I thought originally. And after doing this deep dive, I've come to consider codependency to be another personality disorder. And in this lecture, I'm going to be making a case for including this. Maybe not the DSM, because the DSM isn't the end-all and be-all of wisdom in our field. For example, passive-aggressive personality disorder, or sadistic personality disorder, or psychopathic personality disorder. I still use these. These are not in the DSM, but they are in the literature. And I would say that codependency is a personality disorder. And I'm going to make an argument for that because we have other words that describe non-personality disorder codependent behavior, which I'm going to get into. There's things like overfunctioning, or just simply enabling, or what we call prodependence as opposed to codependence, or being addicted to relationships. There's all these different terms that kind of get mishmashed into codependency. And I want to get into that. So this is going to be a long one. I'm going to be talking about the definition. I've made my own definition. I'm going to be giving other definitions that other people have proposed, and there are a lot, and they are varied. I'm going to give the feminist critique of codependency, which is valid. I'm going to obviously describe codependency, the core components, other possible components. I'm going to talk about the results of codependency, what kind of outcomes, like negative outcomes, that are a result of being a codependent person. And I think most importantly, which I always find to be the most satisfying portion of these kinds of lectures that I do on the podcast, I'm going to go into the types of codependency, because I think this elucidates I have 3 different types that I've come up with, and I think it really helps to understand the types, because they are different, but they share a core foundation that I'll get into. I'm going to talk about the cause, what the research says, and what my own opinion is as to what causes codependency in people. I'm going to delineate it between, as I said, overfunctioning, dependent personality disorder, simply enabling, prodependence, addiction to relationships, just being in a bad relationship, and 2 people who are pathologically dependent on each other. I'm going to talk about proposed criteria and other measures. What is in the research literature regarding codependency? What are the proposed DSM criteria? What are the psychological instruments that we will administer to determine how codependent you are? And if you're following along at home, you could actually tally your score and maybe figure out how codependent you are. Of course, it's just you'd probably want to seek out professional help if you were actually to have a confident score. But anyway, I'm also going to give a lot of examples because, again, I think that's where the real understanding of codependency comes from, is talking about actual human beings that I know or have treated or have been in popular culture. At the end, I'm going to go over the history of the term and help us understand how we got to where we are. It goes back to, the early 20th century, as a lot of things in our field do. And then I'm going to end with treatment, how to treat, how to change one's codependency. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. As I said earlier, this episode is just for patrons of the podcast. So if you're not a patron of the podcast and you want to hear this whole episode on codependency, you want to go to patreon.com and become a patron. When you become a patron, you'll gain access to this episode along with hundreds of others of our best episodes, arguably other deep dives. Also, know that a portion of your pledge goes towards various charities that we support and also goes towards scholarships. We've given out, I think, over $10,000 or $12,000. Because of you, patrons who've already signed up, a portion of your pledge has gone toward giving scholarships to students who are making a difference in the world and plan to do wonderful things for society and people. And so thank you so much for being a patron. And if you're not a patron, it's up to you, but you can do that now if you want. All right.